Let's talk more then about the President's participation in the Cairo Peace Summit. I'm joined tonight by Professor Duvenhage, political analyst with the Northwest University. A very good evening to you, sir. Good to have your time. So, in Cairo yesterday, President Ramaphosa said this: fulfilling Palestinian aspirations for human rights, dignity and statehood is the only path to peace with Israel. That has been said for decades now. How do we get there?
Good evening. Yes, I think that is the big challenge. We know that a war cannot continue forever. And at some point, you need to end up by some sort of a negotiated settlement, peace talks, and to building, the building of a settlement. And at the moment, the conditions aren't good for getting a negotiated settlement underway. Now, we know there's a long history of conflict. If you talk about the Israeli state, it's now for more than 70 years that the war is continuing. But the current one is very serious. I think more than 1,000 Israelis were killed. Already more than 3,000 people, Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, is killed, and Israel is only starting its land and sea offensive. But I think the point, and that is the point that Mr. Ramaphosa made, is very important, and that is that South Africa is an example of a conflict that escalated over decades and years, and at the end of the day, we came together, we sit, we negotiate, and we ended up with a constitution in the 1996 constitution as an agreement. And that is the way he is seeing, and he is also asking the United Nations to take us forward in that way. Mm-hmm. My problem, however, with the peace summit in Egypt is that crucial role players aren't part of the negotiation process. And these crucial groups include the State of Israel, which in fact is a problem because Hamas and other states, some other states of the Arab League, is not recognizing the Israeli state. But then other actors excluded is places like states like Syria, Iran, Russia, United States of America, and some Western countries.
The issue of the Palestinians, of course, is made more complicated by the fractured sets of leadership. You've got the Gaza Strip, which in the last election, which was years ago, it must be said, Hamas enjoyed more political support. And then you go on to the West Bank, areas such as Ramallah, where there is in fact no Hamas presence there. You've got President Mahmoud Abbas, whose legitimacy itself is in question, yet he was at that round table yesterday in Cairo. But I wonder if the only means to actual negotiation that will amount to anything would actually, in fact, have to be between the Israeli government and Hamas directly. And is it even possible?
Well, I think you are right with the assumption. But at the moment, we have an active, escalating war that is going on between these groups. Hamas is not recognizing the state of Israel, so it is very difficult from an Israel point of view to negotiate with someone that is not recognizing your existence and your legitimacy. And that is bringing us back to the 1967 solution of a dual state approach, where there's room for a Palestinian state and the Israel state. And I still believe, even today, that this is the bigger framework for a solution. But at this point in time, we are far away from that. There are many other issues when it comes to the two-state approach. One is the position of Jerusalem, and specifically East Jerusalem. But I think your argument are 100%. We need to get the right role players on board if we want to have a negotiated settlement that will stood the test of times.
seemingly impossible to get there because both the Israeli government and indeed Hamas regard each other as terrorist groups. When you look at what you just mentioned now, 1967, there was a war even then already, and ultimately after that about a week or so of violence, there was the Israeli occupation of areas including Gaza. The Israelis subsequently left there in the mid-2000s, Gaza specifically, but there was also an occupation of areas such as the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which you referenced. And yesterday in Cairo, there were some leaders who said what we need to go back to, perhaps, is a two-state solution that is basically built on the 1967 borders. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, was quite outraged when even Barack Obama made a similar suggestion more than 10 years ago, I think around 2011. When you look at the sort of political pressure that he's in now, in Israel, where people are asking Netanyahu why it is that his government was unable to anticipate and prevent the unprecedented Hamas assault on the 7th of October, and the fact that he hasn't been very popular with the public there in the last year, protests to do with the change, for example, of the powers of the country's most Supreme Court. What are the chances that Netanyahu will want to negotiate along the 1967 arrangement? Because many people in Israel say, well, that would be a step too far.
Well, maybe a part of the answer is that Netanyahu at the moment is fighting within Israel to survive politically. And there's a lot of resistance against him within Israel itself and with his political reforms. So I think in a way he is definitely not going to be persuaded to become part of a negotiated settlement. The Israelis at this point in time has felt the killing of the more than 1,000 people, who is probably one of the biggest attacks on Israel and the highest number of casualties since the establishment of the Israel state. And I think they are in the mode of revenge, and they believe that they have this window of opportunity to bring about some changes, to take revenge. So I'm not reading Israel at this point that they will negotiate. On the other side, the signals I am picking up from Hamas is quite similar, that they will continue with the war, and we have heard that the Hezbollah also may want to become involved in this war. There are some signals that Iran may also be actively become involved if there's a formal land attack on the Gaza Strip from the side of Israel. There's a warning coming from Turkey towards the Americans at this point. So my assessment is that it has a high potential rather to escalate than to de-escalate. And I'm expecting an escalation of the war before de-escalation, and only in an environment of de-escalation there is the possibility for negotiations and peace building. And
is there a clear red line, if you will, Professor Duvenhage, as to what would basically tip this to the extent of a regional conflict? You know, in Iran, the supreme leader has already suggested that there will come a point where if the Israelis don't stop the bombardment of the Gaza Strip, that, and he used the phrase, Muslim nations will have no other choice but to respond. But no one seems to understand where that red line would be. Is it any clearer to you?
No, it is not clear to me precisely where the red line is. We try to read and interpret the messages coming from both sides. My understanding of that red line is a formal attack, a land attack on the Gaza Strip, and the actual invasion of Gaza by Israel. I think that is, according to my understanding, the red line. Now, what the red line meant is not clear, because in a way Iran is already indirectly involved. They are supporting Hezbollah, they are supporting Hamas. The Russians are also supporting Hezbollah and Hamas. So they are in some way involved in this war. We know about 2 American aircraft carriers. The one is already in the Middle East, the Gerald Ford, and the Dwight D. Eisenhower is on its way to the Middle East. So it is not clear precisely which line we are talking about, because there's a conflict between the Russians and the Americans, and we think about what is going on in terms of the Russian-Ukrainian war. This is the West versus the Russians. It is Turkey that has warned the Americans, but on the other side, they are part of NATO, and then there is Iran that is in a position not too far away from Russia. And this is becoming a very, very complicated situation. The Russians has huge influence in Syria. We know they were there involved in the civil war that is ongoing in Syria. So it is becoming a very complicated situation with a lot of red lines and a lot of potential dynamics that can literally overnight create a new scenario.
Professor Andre Duvenhage, good to speak to you, political analyst with the Northwest University. Thank you for your time tonight, sir.